Hello, everybody, and welcome to Get Your Paint On
Woo!
with Doug Seacat. What am I painting today, Josh?
Death and destruction, sadness.
Where's my model?
Oh God, this is so embarrassing. What kind of a hotshot operation do we run here?
No, it's really a lore cast. It's not Get Your Paint On.
Yay!
I do paint from time to time.
It's true.
I'm not particularly good at it, so they wouldn't ask me on Get Your Paint On. But we're taking over the airwaves again for a little lore cast. We have Josh Colon and I'm Doug Seacat. We write for Privateer Press. And ostensibly I'm in charge of continuity. It's debatable from time to time. But anyway, we're here to talk a little bit about Archons, gods, religions, big topics.
Oh, big topics.
I don't know how this could go many different ways as we're talking about it. I do want to try to get through the Archons if we can.
Sure.
But there's definitely, we're talking about big weighty stuff. But before we get into that, let's talk about our
Some housekeeping.
Some housekeeping. So I want to talk a little bit about Mini Crate, what's going on with Mini Crate. We have the Ancestral Guardian Angel, which is something you can get until April 19th. Is that how that works?
Yes.
Subscribe by April 19th and you can get the Ancestral Guardian Angel. I don't think it was planned exactly this way, but there's some interesting visual aspects of the Ancestral Guardian Angel, which might relate to our topic.
It certainly does.
I think that if you happen to be a Scorn player, getting a hold of the Ancestral Guardian Angel would be a good idea.
Or a couple, honestly.
Sure.
Yeah.
There might be some tournament issues related to legality of certain things, but anyway, I think the Ancestral Guardian Angel is particularly pertinent to what we're talking about today. We also, of course, have the Legend of the Five Rings subscription. If you subscribe by May 5th, you get it's Kaito Kasuri of the Phoenix Clan, one of our Legend of the Five Rings champions. And so again, that's by May 5th to get a hold of Kaito Kasuri. And then we have the Bride of Arcadius, which is free with a VIP subscription. And that is good through August 19th. And so that's where we're at with Mini Crate. Be sure to go to minicrate.com/L5R and subscribe today. There's some real good stuff up on there. Also want to talk a little bit about Lock and Load 2019. The tickets are still on sale. If you want to come here and meet Privateer people, if you want to talk to Josh, ask him questions, bribe him with alcohol or whatever, try to get some real answers out of people. You could talk to the designers, maybe play a 9-hour game with Jason Souls of War Machine.
He loves those.
That has been known to happen.
I've knows as a fact. He loves those.
I don't know if that'll still happen with him getting older and more tired, but anyway, Lock and Load's definitely your best chance to come and interact with us directly. And tickets are on sale at pplockandload.com. So that is, I think, all of our housekeeping. Oh, right. There's also some other shows other than this one that occasionally happen.
Occasionally.
So normally our weekly shows are the Dev Hangout, which happens on Wednesdays. And that the specific attendance varies depending on our convention schedule. When our convention schedule is going crazy is when Josh and I get to steal the airwaves like we are today. Get Your Paint On is usually on Thursdays in the slot that we're at right now. But as noted, we are not letting me paint a mini today. But I think everything's due to be back next week. On schedule.
Yep.
And the devs have at least hinted that it's possible that the CID for the Oblivion CID will be starting next week.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at with the schedule. But let's get back to the lore cast. We wanted to. The devs talked a little bit about the Archons yesterday, and I kind of wanted to get into that a little bit. It's definitely one of the more exciting releases I think we've had, just from a cosmological perspective.
Right. They're a big deal.
One of my favorite aspects of the setting in general has been the religions and kind of the relationship between the gods, and it's something I've always enjoyed getting into. And so the notion of having these Archons manifest on Cain to help with the infernal battles is I think it's one of our more exciting releases that we've done. Just from a broader standpoint, we haven't shown gods interfering in quite this way until now.
So, Mr. Wizard, let's start basics.
Sure.
What is an Archon?
So one of the ideas with Archons is that they are something of a representative, a direct spiritual entity that is maybe sent by the gods, maybe prayed for to intervene. There's a variety of different ways the Archons can come into being, but they're supposed to be an embodiment of a higher power. And the idea is that all of our gods have certain rules that they have to follow as far as interfering with the living world.
Right.
Most of our gods, other than like Dunya, exist in Archon, which is like a separate realm. That's like the afterlife where people go when they die. It's hard for the gods to interfere with things happening on Cain from Archon. There's like the barrier between the worlds. And so it's not easy for the gods to just kind of show up on the world and do things. Like in theory, that has happened in the past, but rarely, and that's a big deal. One of the ideas is that even Menoth hasn't really been seen on the world in a long time. He usually tends to work through his mortal followers, that kind of thing. And so an Archon is the closest you usually will get to a direct divinity manifesting on the world. It's kind of like a little piece of the god that's sent down to do some work.
So for example, are the Morrowind Archons ascendant, or like what are they?
Well, one of the general concepts with the term Archon is that, and I can't remember, we might have gotten into this a little bit before, but the term is most closely tied to the Morrowind religion. When we've talked about Archons in the past in this setting, it hasn't been in this sort of more general way that we're talking about it now. We have specifically in the Morrowind faith, there's what's called the host of Archons, and they're considered these angelic beings, so you could consider that kind of like a host of angels. And the idea is that Morrow is one of these gods that has been more active in mortal affairs since Morrow ascended than most of the other gods until recently. Right. And one of the ideas with the background of the Protectorate is that Menoth has recently gotten real stirred up and has been showing more miracles. He's been getting a lot more involved. And that kind of creates a little bit of sort of a biased perspective, I think, with the War Machine audience on our setting, where it's easy to think, since we have a Protectorate army, we have all of these miraculous heroes, that Menoth is the god that's really been with mankind, doing things actively. But in the history, until the recent period, the Morrowind manifestations were kind of a lot more prevalent, or at least if anybody was looking in the history books, there were more cases of like people witnessing Morrow sending Archons down to do things. Like one of the most notable examples of this in the Morrowind faith is the Primarch, who's the leader of the religion. Just so there'd be no question about who should be in charge, several Archons actually show up and like point out the new Primarch. And it's kind of funny contrasting that with like the Menite way of doing things, where we've got like multiple periods of huge turmoil, civil war in the Protectorate. But that's how Menoth likes to do it. Like he doesn't think he needs to come down and interfere to that degree.
The kids will figure it out.
The kids will figure it out. The priests, basically, he kind of set it up to where it's like the priest that is the most badass will take charge. And maybe that takes a few years, maybe some lives are lost, but Morrow is a little bit more direct, where he's like, a couple Archons show up, they're like, this is the guy. This is your new Primarch.
So I think some of the confusion that I'm seeing from people trying to understand is like, so an Archon isn't just someone who like ascends or through service. They're agents of that.
Yeah, one of the ideas, like I said, it's kind of a big topic, but the idea with the Morrowind religion is that any mortal soul can become greater, can kind of ascend toward the divine. In theory, most don't, but there's a few special mortals that have kind of reached a higher form. And in the Morrowind religion, the greatest of these are the ascendants. And similarly, in the Thamorite religion, which is sort of the dark counterpart of Morrow's philosophy, we have the Scions. And these are almost like demigods. These are really powerful ascended beings who are also kind of transcend and go on to Urkane. And because of that, it's also hard for them to come manifest on Kane. They still can, but the notion that kind of to keep in mind with all this stuff is the more spiritually powerful you are, the more godlike you are, the harder it is to travel back and forth between the worlds. And so as a god, if you want to affect things on the world, you need to find ways to do that short of showing up yourself. And so for Morrow, that might be like, it'd be easier for an ascendant to manifest than for Morrow himself. So that's one way to do it. Then you have this host of Archons, which in the background of the setting, it's believed that each of the Primarchs, when they die, becomes an Archon, and that maybe certain other great heroes of the faith might become an Archon in the afterlife. So these are very powerful mortal religious leaders or representatives of the faith who aren't quite ascended. They aren't like fully ascendants, but they have kind of become greater than they were. And one of the other ideas with the Archons, for the most part, is that they're not individual characters, at least not exactly. It gets kind of weird and complicated, but like, even though, like, let's say you were a Primarch in your life, you die, you ascend, you become an Archon, you kind of give up your own individuality.
Your personality a little bit.
Yeah, you join the host and kind of become part of Morrow.
This union.
Yeah, so the notion is you're giving up a little bit of yourself to have this greater service. And the degree to which that's true could vary. Like, we've kind of suggested in the background that, maybe there's like a little bit of the old personality still in there. So like, if an Archon manifested, maybe there's a little bit of some former great hero of Morrow inside there. We're not really sure. But for the most part, it's doing what this Archon is doing, what Morrow wants.
Especially if in the service of that mission, that person's personality might help that mission. And Morrow decides, they might listen more to this Primarch or blah, blah, blah.
Right. Yeah. And one of the other ideas kind of related to that is, even though like we're making Archons as miniatures, they are a specific sculpt that look awesome. I'm really happy with all the various Archons we've seen. There's a couple that are still kind of in process that aren't completely finalized yet in terms of the art. But we're seeing a sculpt which is basically one interpretation of what like the Morrowan Archons could look like. One of the inherent ideas with all the Archons is that they could appear different than what we see. There could be other forms. There may be like, even one of the Ascendants could maybe manifest through an Archon. You could have an Archon that looks like one of the Ascendants.
Right.
Or it could look just like a giant glowing pillar of light, or there's the idea being that this is a spiritual being. It's taking on sort of a tangible form, but it's not like locked into that shape. And that's particularly true with some of the more weird abstract Archons that we'll talk about momentarily. But the Morrowan Archons, which we kind of consider to be sort of the template, the starting point for these, that's like where the term is rooted in our setting. It's also where we get like our angelic statuary. Like people who've been with us for a long time in the Witchfire trilogy might remember that we've got like statues of what look like angels in like cities like Corvus and Merowyn, and so the idea is that a lot of that statuary is drawn from Archon imagery of like people who have seen Archons manifest and have described it to their local sculptor or whatever. And in my mind, there was always some uncertainty in the exact look of an Archon. Like even these wings that we see on the Archons, like that, it's not like they actually have physical wings all the time. Like I was imagining sometimes that could be literally just light. People who've played Diablo, I often imagine the Archons looking a little bit like the angels in Diablo sometimes.
Right, so their interpretation, their artistic
again, it's an interpretation. Yeah. But when they take tangible form, they might appear like what people expect them to. So you could almost imagine it being kind of one of those feedback loops where it's like, early Archons appear as this more abstract, sort of light spiritual form. people create statues of Archons. Now the next time an Archon shows up, it looks more like an angel. It has these elements that you expect, an Archon to have. And the main reason why I bring that up is the notion that there could be different looking Archons than what we see here. And I'm personally looking forward to seeing people customize their Archons, making ones that really fit into what they want them to look like. I know there's limits from a tournament standard on what you can get away with to have a playable model, but Archons are weird enough spiritually that they could look like any number of things.
Right. The observer, as I'm seeing in chat, the observer kind of sees the idealized version of what the Archon.
And that's another idea that we talk about a little bit in Oblivion in the background, is that like in the same battle, like let's say there was a battle happening where an Archon shows up, two different people might see it different.
Right.
And so that's kind of an important thing. But anyway, so that's kind of our foundation with the idea of the Morrowind Archons being something that has been tangibly seen, talked about, witnessed more often. But that doesn't mean that these other Archons, that the other gods don't have ways of affecting the world.
Sure.
And the most common way for gods to affect the world is through mortal followers. And that's been particularly the case with the creator of man, your favorite god in the setting, the lawgiver. One of the ideas is that the Archons that we'll see, the Menite Archons, that's a real rare thing. That's like a special something that I don't know if I'd 100% say that it's unprecedented, but it's close. Like the idea being Menoth does not generally manifest through Archons on Cain, and it's sort of a sign of the danger that's represented by
things have gotten.
The Infernals in particular, the fact that Menoth has chosen to intervene in this way. Now there are other ways that Menoth has shown direct intervention, and we'll get into that with some of these others. Like each of these gods has multiple ways they can try to affect the world, and the Harbinger is one of the biggest. Like until the appearance of a Menite Archon, you could consider the Harbinger to be the closest we've seen up until that point of Menoth's hand directly in the world.
But she's not an Archon.
She is not an Archon, but the idea is like, the way I think of the Harbinger is that that Menoth has created sort of this permanent, long-standing channel where he can anytime he wants, he can kind of look through the Harbinger. He can sort of use her as a conduit for his power, and he can speak through her. But as we've discussed before, she's still a character. She's still a person. She sometimes makes choices. She's not always speaking in the Menoth voice, like we've kind of shown in the fiction, that when Menoth is actually doing his thing, he's there's some change to like her voice, or there's like a sense of presence that otherwise isn't there. Similarly, we have the Avatar.
It's a living miracle.
It's a miracle.
Yeah.
Personally, I've suggested that it might not actually be always like Menoth driving the Avatar around, just because I have to think that as a god, he's got better things to do than driving the Avatar around all the time.
In the fiction, in Extirpation, Nemo theorized that it might be a hierarch, an ancient hierarch or something.
Yeah, I've always, one of the ideas with the Menite religion is that their afterlife is called the City of Man. It's this huge walled domain in the afterlife. And we've always had in mind that the priests have sort of special standing in the afterlife. Like the Menite paradise is a little bit, it's not as idealized as some afterlives go. Like there's still a lot of work you have to do if you're a Menite in the afterlife. Like you don't get out of working by being dead. But the priests do live a little better. Like maybe they got a little better place to live. They get maybe higher up on the wall. But they also have responsibilities. They have oversight. And I think the priests are the ones that might be chosen to go back sometimes. Like we've talked about the notion of some of the priest kings, sort of their presence inhabiting like some of the reliquaries that empower the colossals, and so there is this idea that some of the formerly living Menites can be sent back. And I like the notion that even like the Menite Archons, like that's one of my favorite of the pieces of art, and I don't think we have that here yet.
No.
But Hungerford described it a little bit yesterday. It's this sort of like armored figure that's full of fire, and it almost looks like sort of like an empty suit of armor that's just inhabited by the
living
fire,
flame.
the living flame of Menoth. But I think that in that fire, it could be a former priest king. Like that could be one way that you could interpret this, this emissary of the god.
We were talking about how Menoth, more so than most of the gods, is very unsubtle with his miracles.
Yeah, he tends to be a little overt.
So it makes sense his Archon would also be less subtle than any of the other ones.
And actually that's something I should talk about a little bit with the Morrowind Archons. Like in the past, like I said, there have been signs of Morrowind Archons, but they don't tend to do a lot usually. Like until now, until the Infernal Invasion, like an Archon would be more of like bringing prophecies or like signs and portents. Like we had an Archon show up in the Witchfire trilogy related to the Legion of Lost Souls, which helped save Corvus. And the idea is that there was this battle hundreds of years before where pious Morrowinds fell in combat, and an Archon showed up and asked for them to be entombed in a special way and prophesized that they would return at like an hour of need. And so that's kind of how the Archons work. And sometimes like that we even have something I explored in one of our No Quarter stories is there's a form of divination known as arcanomancy, which is like if an Archon shows up in front of you, like everything about it is theoretically,
if it's holding a pen,
symbolic.
If it's like the way
what it's carrying, how it's dressed. If it takes on like a face, if it has like one of the former Primarch faces, that could all be interpreted as meaning. And so people have to kind of figure out what is Morrow saying? Why did this angel show up when I was taking a nap?
It's like divine charades.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Whereas Menoth is a little more direct.
He's like fire there.
Light that guy on fire. Mm-hmm. I need this guy over here lit on fire. Oh, there's a lot of lighting people on fire is how it usually works.
It's true.
Now we have shown there's been other subtle signs, like we showed the Harbinger serving as a prophet, anticipating Asphyxius's shenanigans in the Thornwood with the Temple Garad, for example. So
and Reclaimers see things a little.
Reclaimers do too. Well, still, but like there is some degree of interpretation that always happens. And I think that's kind of important to bear in mind with all our religions is even the more direct gods, there's always a little bit of like people having to figure out what they need. But like with the Reclaimers, they probably it's almost like a hit list. It's like you see a guy and you're like, maybe I should kill him? I probably need to kill this guy. And they need to be reclaimed. Mm-hmm. And so usually it's not like, a sparrow crossing over a pond and, its shadow falls on a snake or, it's nothing like that. It's just, here's a guy, burn him up. So it's a little bit more direct.
So we should talk about the twins.
Yeah, sure. Right? Well, I guess we were already kind of diving into it a little bit, but one of the real fun parts of Oblivion, from my standpoint, is the idea of an alliance again between the twins. And we have the symbols here, which Tony's bringing up, of the Morrowind symbol on the left, which is the Radiance, and the Turnian brand on the right. This is a symbol of Morrow and Thamar. The twins are I would say our most sort of subtle philosophical gods. Loosely representing benevolence and selfishness, but each of them has a lot of complication going on. And one of the important aspects of our faiths is, even though the Morrowind and Thamarite religions are at odds about a lot of the specifics, these gods have worked together, especially to kind of help humanity in the past. The largest case of that being when they basically defied Menoth to give humanity magic to fight against the Orgoth. And that's kind of one of our fundamental religious rifts in our setting is that Thamar, in bestowing on humanity the gift of magic, which is we have an illustration on the left here, which is intended to kind of represent Thamar giving mankind, represented by this robed guy here who's got his books, and he's very happy to get whatever it is she's handing off. But the idea is that she's basically bestowing magic on humanity symbolically in this illustration. But Morrow also brings a lot to the equation. Like we have the notion that between these two gods, in the defiance of the true law of just simple obedience of Menoth, we see mankind entering kind of a golden era of thought and development. Like a lot of our scientific advancements are kind of rooted in what Morrow brought to the table of like questioning authority, questioning wanting to have answers rather than just having everything told to you by the priest caste.
Right.
And so yeah, during the Orgoth Rebellion, we have this apocryphal notion in the myths that Morrow is one of our greatest prophets. He's one of our gods who sees the future more clearly than other gods, and he saw that his faith was going to be extinguished by the Orgoth. He saw both his faith and Thamar's faith were going to be extinguished. And you could kind of imagine it as one of those scenes where, he's looking at all these possible futures, and they all end badly for his faith, until he brings this to Thamar's attention, and she proposes that she has an idea of a way that they could give humanity the power to fight back against the Orgoth. And with that information, Morrow, looking into the future, sees that if he allows Thamar to do what she wants, their faiths will survive. Right. And maybe that's dark, maybe there's some bad things that could be part of that, but the greater outcome is for the better. And so we have this notion of the twins both kind of entering into this almost unholy pact. And the details of that are all unknown. And a lot of the sort of the blame, if you want to call it, a lot of the dark side of that is put on Thamar, as being Thamar is the one who negotiated with Infernals potentially to bring magic to humanity. But from a cosmological standpoint, both of the twins had to be involved in that. And part of that goes back to the idea that from a cosmological level, when Menoth accepted the twins as gods, which he's like, okay, I guess you guys came up here to Urkane. I guess you're gods, fine.
Whatever.
You're not as cool as me, but you're still gods. One of the ideas is that Morrow offered Menoth something, which is, I can help oversee humanity. There's a lot of details in shepherding humanity that maybe you consider to be annoying. Like, you have other things you would rather do, like chasing the devourer worm. It's like one of Menoth's favorite things.
His favorite hobby.
His favorite hobby is chasing the worm. And so Morrow offered to kind of like attend to a lot of the sort of lesser spiritual oversight of humanity. And basically Menoth allowed that under certain stipulations, like keeping an eye on his sister, not giving humanity certain things, like greater power. And so you have Morrow as the shepherd kind of idea of humanity, and that gives him the power to maybe enact this agreement with the Infernals. So Thamar is the one doing the negotiations. She's the one like contacting, Teldecorin, the opener of the ways, or I can't remember exactly, sounder at the gates. I think that's his name. Putting in place this arrangement to empower humanity, but Morrow was key to seeing that actually happen, because he actually has oversight over a certain degree of humanity. His divine endowment by the Creator, it kind of opens this loophole of, now we can give humanity something that maybe their Creator didn't want. And that's considered sort of, from a theological standpoint, kind of a betrayal. Morrow kind of went against what the Creator wanted, and then that caused a lot of friction between their religions. And so that kind of plays into a lot of our religious conflict. But in the end of the day, like once the Infernals are invading, there's bigger concerns, because now all of humanity is at risk. One of the concepts we never knew the exact terms that Thamar entered into with the Infernals, but one of the ideas, even from like our earliest backgrounds, is that there was going to be a great cost to pay eventually. It's like some centuries down the line, the Infernals are going to want basically the souls that were promised them, and it had to be a large number. If you're doing like a change that's going to affect like an entire species, an entire race, there had to be a big offering. And so now one of the ideas with the infernal invasion is the infernals have come to collect, and maybe the twins are trying to get out of that arrangement. They're trying to get out of the deal that they made, and we can see their support for humanity with the Archons that they're sending to protect their people. And it's one of the times when we see the gods intervening more directly. It's still not direct enough by some people's standards. Like let's say you're in a Signarin city, and like some infernal horror is like gobbling up your neighbors, and sure, an Archon shows up, eventually destroys it, but maybe it's too late for Aunt Sally or whoever. Done. Like the god is not actually there.
Right.
It'd be easy to kind of be like, well, I mean, thanks, I guess, but couldn't you send more?
That's true.
And one of the ideas is that probably the gods can't. Like this might be as much as they can intervene. There might be other things occupying their attention, their time. This is the most they can do to affect the world, or so they would say.
And that's why we're getting these sweet models, these sweet angel models in a War Machine Hordes. Tony, don't we have one? Don't we have a?
Yeah, let's show, before we move on to a couple of the other Archons, let's show we've got some concept art on the Morrowind Archon, which I think we've also shown through your social media, right?
Or, yeah, we have the
and the art. That's right. You were showing the showing the Thamurite.
The Thamurite one is somewhere in social media.
Yeah, you should look at our Instagram for. Yeah. I don't have other concept art here because Josh wants to hold them as little prizes that he wants to show in the forthcoming days. But keep an eye on our Instagram. We'll be seeing some other concept art. But as I was saying, the idea is that this is one iteration of the Morrowind Archon that's probably one of the closer iterations to the statuary that we've seen in our cities. But yeah, so we've mostly been talking about kind of our human gods. We've been talking about Morrow, Thamar, and Manoth.
But what about the wilds, Doug?
But then we get into the wilds. Yeah. Well, actually, yeah, I think it's important to bear in mind that the infernal invasion affects everybody, and I think it's really exciting that we're seeing things, even like the Menite Archon, because like we said, we've kind of talked about Menoth being an aloof father figure, but seeing a Dunyan Archon is what I'm really excited for, and I don't think we have the final art for that yet. But the Dunyan religion is one of these ones that's really vital and important to kind of the fundamentals of our setting. If you read like Protectorate books, they claim that the world was created by Menoth. And I wouldn't want to gainsay them if like a Scrutator was standing behind me. No. But we've shown in like Unleashed and elsewhere that the Dunyan legends suggest maybe that Dunya and Cain and even the rise of the Trollkin might predate humanity entirely, might even predate Menoth. And so Dunya is kind of, we've suggested, at least again in the myths of our wilderness people, that Dunya is basically like the first primal goddess, and all life ostensibly springs from Dunya. And she's also been one of our most elusive gods. Like this is the Dunyan symbol that we've shown, which is kind of intended to be a little bit of an abstraction of maybe like pregnancy.
Right.
You kind of have this sense of fullness and a being within another being. But the idea is that there could be these ancient Dunyan stone totems that kind of represent a pregnant female form, and we've shown that several of the races that worship Dunya most directly, like the Ogren and the Trollkin and Gobbers, they kind of tend to see Dunya as a reflection of their own people. And so the Trollkin, of course, consider themselves particularly favored of Dunya. They view themselves as basically the first people. And there's some reason to suspect they could be right. Like the first intelligent people walking around on Cain might have been Trollkin, long before humanity. And in their myths, which is considered a heresy by the Mennonites, they believe that Menoth was created as a hunter to chase the devourer worm, to kind of give Dunya a break. Like, she's constantly being harassed by the devourer worm. He's running amok. He's got all these predatory creatures that are attacking everything. But between Dunya and the devourer worm, we have kind of all life coming into being, and the idea from the Trollkin standpoint would be that the devourer worm is sort of their male divine father, and the Dunya is the female, the mother, and that kind of all life springs ultimately from that. And even, they would argue that even the other gods ultimately kind of trace back to Dunya one way or another. And we don't always have like kind of a direct explanation for it. And Toruk is sort of left out of the whole Dunyan myth equation, because Toruk isn't considered a living thing. Some people don't even consider Toruk a god.
But that goes back to what Hungerford was saying yesterday about the Dunyan Archon being supportive in rules, gameplay-wise, right? That fits in thematically with the Dunyan philosophy of nurturing life and springing life and fertility and those kinds of things.
Right, and I think there's kind of a fun cosmological symmetry in the notion of this. These natural gods, we have Dunya on one side, we have the worm on the other, and the idea that these represent two sides of nature, which is represented with the circle Ouroboros through the concept of Ouroboros itself. One of the ideas that we have in our ancient myths, like this is one of my favorite illustrations, the one on the left in particular, is sort of this cave drawing where we see maybe some primitive humans, in the early days, visualizing the devourer worm as just this maw of teeth,
right? The great predator,
the great predator, and one of the ideas is that, like in this sort of ancient prehistorical mythical time, if Dunya created Menoth as the hunter, the first hunter, this giant, powerful, masked figure that could fight with the devourer worm, wherever Menoth walked, as Menoth was chasing the worm, the idea is that humanity kind of sprang up in the wake of the passage of Menoth. It almost feels like from the myths that it could have been almost like a natural process rather than like I'm creating humanity. It's not like I'm trying to make humanity. It's just they're appearing as like a reflection of this hunter. And so we have this long period that could have been, I don't know, thousands of years in prehistory where humans are in these tribal groups, and Menoth's busy. He's off chasing the worm, and he didn't have time to come down and help him out. And so we have humanity in this sort of tribal state that is worshiping these totems and worshiping these predatory creatures. And so that's kind of where we tie in humanity with the worship of the worm. And it's sort of the origins of the Circle Ouroboros kind of go back to this reconciliation with these natural powers, and the idea that they see Ouroboros as being both Dunya and the worm, and that all of that's tied together. And it's one of the reasons why in the game the Dunyan Archon can fight for the circle as well. And I don't have all the rules in front of me, but I think it might be considered partisan. I don't know exactly how the partisan rules work.
I'm pretty sure the primal one is partisan.
The primal's partisan for circle, but the Dunyan might be partisan for the Trollbloods. I'm not sure.
And that can all change.
You'll see in the CID. But
we're not the dev guys.
But one of the overall concepts I think it's important when you're thinking about this stuff is that even though we're finding ways to give representation to all the factions with the Archons, is our gods are not part of factions.
Right, they're above all that.
Yeah, they're above that. Like the closest we get is the Protectorate with Menoth, because they're very directly being guided by their god, and there's certain stipulations put down. But even there, like we've had Menite worshippers in all the different human kingdoms. There's a large number of Menite worshippers in Khador,
which we'll see in that new theme force.
Yeah, the new theme force. So, but the gods are not the faction. The gods are a higher being that has other things going on, other concerns. A faction might temporarily be useful to a god, or might have a majority of people that worship that god. Most Signarans are Morrowans, and so Morrow gets a lot of strength from helping Signar, and that's the headquarters of the Church of Morrow is in the capital, right, in the Sanctium. But there could be times when in a given conflict, maybe what Khador is doing is more important tomorrow.
I'd like to reiterate something that's important because we talked about this too, is gods have different natures, and
Sure.
they manifest in different ways. So, like when we talk about the wild, the worm, things like the Lord of the Feast or,
sure.
or Wormwood, right? These are not archons, right?
Right, but they are like another term that we've used in the fiction is the idea of like I mean, the avatar is another great synonym for this. There's the avatar, which is the warjack, but the notion is that both the Lord of the Feast and Wormwood are theoretically avatars or aspects of the devourer worm. Theoretically, maybe Barnabas is too.
Right.
Now that
he
he's a
wouldn't
god,
consider himself
he does
that.
not consider himself that, and that's the fun part about the devourer worm in particular. The devourer worm is a very chaotic being. It's the beast of all shapes. And these gods aren't limited to like a single perspective, or they can exist in a multiplicity.
I mean, Kosk might actually be an aspect of
yes,
the devourer worm.
right. So Kosk, which the Gatormen consider their god, could also be an aspect of the devourer worm while still being Kosk. And that's not a contradiction.
Right.
And similarly, like you could have the Lord of the Feast, which was in ancient times like a warlord who entered into some kind of pact with the worm and kind of became this ever-hungry avatar of carnage. Like the Lord of the Feast could fight Wormwood, and that's not a problem.
Right.
Because they are also characters that have their own beliefs and their own way of representing the devourer worm, and it's one of the, to me, it's one of the more fun aspects of the devourer worm is this almost madness of multiple forms. Like all predators are theoretically an extension
of the worm,
and
right.
one predator can eat another predator, and that's totally fine. And so
it's just a cycle of things.
Yeah, and so the primal archon is another is kind of it's the first of our archons that in theory could represent more than one thing, although for the most part it is intended to be sort of an embodiment of that devourer worm multiplicity. And there's some oddities when we get to both the primal and the void archon in particular, which we'll talk about in a second.
Chat is just hungry for the
I know.
archon discussion.
But the primal archon, there's one of the things that was hard for me to get my head around a little bit is that it also can that the Legion is represented by the primal archon, which feels weird.
This is tough. This is real tough.
But I like that even as they were talking about it yesterday on the dev chat with Hungerford, like some people came up with some good explanations of this sort of like blighted, version of this primal energy that like, but the other thing to bear in mind is that the Nis themselves were a wilderness people, and the Nis, they still have souls. That like the fact is that Nis falling to infernals is still a bad thing. Like any soul that goes to the infernals is
dangerous for
Cain
and
there appear to be these higher powers that are trying to intervene or trying to help, and so there could be powers that are trying to help the Nis, even the blighted ones.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that it's Nisor, or maybe it is, or there's you could interpret a primal archon in the Legion of Everblight as being exactly a blighted natural force, or you could interpret it as an emissary sent by Nisor, or something else.
Or there could be some reverse engineering, right? Like them creating their own blight.
And I'm positive Everblight would love to take
credit
for it. He's like, I put a little blood in that one. Right. Now that one's mine.
Right. I mean, it is true. Kruger did help the Legion, blighting the ley lines. So
yeah, we showed the blighting the ley lines, and that was another thing I wanted to talk about. I guess talking about the primal archon is a good place to talk about it. The fact that the Dunyan archon can work for the Circle Ouroboros is interesting in a couple of ways, because we know that like the Trollkin are at war with the circle. But at the same time, with the idea of Ouroboros and the nature of Dunya as being an embodiment of Cain, one of the ideas with the ley lines is that this is almost like the arteries of Dunya. And so like when the Circle Ouroboros is protecting ley lines and ley line convergences, they're really protecting the body of Dunya, because that's what they consider to be the body of Ouroboros. And so there's plenty of times where the circle, even though they're fighting Trollkin, are keeping Dunya from harm, or sometimes adding some blight into the ley lines and maybe not keeping her from harm. Like probably Kruger's not one of Dunya's favorite people,
no.
But maybe she'll still send an archon to help him out versus the infernals.
So we have 12 minutes.
Sure.
We have to start talking about the Void Archon.
Okay, Void Archon is the weirdest of them all.
This is going to be...
But I like, for me, the Void Archon really represents the unknown. One of the concepts in our cosmology is that there are places beyond Cain and Ur-Cain. There are these places where souls get lost. We have entire races who aren't sure what happens to their souls after death, that think horrible things happen to their souls, that they go into the void. And we have gods that have been lost with the divine court of the elves. So that there are gods that they don't know where they are. They seem to, some horrible fate has happened to them, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily entirely gone. Maybe some of those gods have been destroyed. We know that Syra and Nisor have returned, but we don't know about the other 6 gods in the divine court. And so one of the fun aspects of the Void Archon is the weird combination of factions it can work for, which is, let's see if we can remember them all. It's Convergence, Retribution, Scorn, Crix.
That's it. Those are the 4. Yep.
That's a weird group. Unquestionably a weird group. But what we have there is the notion that in setting, these people wouldn't be considering this like, this is a Void Archon that is coming to assist me. They will, each of these factions probably has a different relationship with these beings, and they would appear somewhat different to these beings. And with the Void Archons, we also have the idea that maybe there could be some rituals involved in bringing these beings here to help with their manifesting in a tangible form. So the art of the Void Archon to me fits really nicely with the Convergence in particular. And the Convergence, the way I imagine that happening in some cases is like, I could imagine there being a construction of a clockwork vessel that then they believe is inhabited by Sirius's will. And so you have something that comes to life after they build it that they don't directly control. And so that becomes an embodiment of the goddess. Similarly with the Retribution, one of the interesting notions is that the Retribution doesn't believe that these Archons are sent by Syra or Nisor, but that they come from somewhere else. And so this could be seen as proof to the Seekers that some of the vanished still exist, even if maybe in a diminished and lost form. And so you could imagine the notion of there being a divinity that they can't reach, but that is able to send some fragment of itself to aid them in their time of need. And
the Crix version is more directly to the ritual.
Yeah,
thing,
and the idea with Crix would be the other bane, the other void that we talk about most often is where the banes come from. And so we might have a situation where the Lich Lords are able to kind of reach into that void and pull out one of these Archons, and maybe they credit Torek for that. Like maybe this being that they can't entirely control is Torek lending aid to their battles. We know that Torek was wounded in the Great Dragon conflict, and so he might be assisting in this, what they would see as a necromantic ritual to bring a greater bane from the void where the banes come from, into the world. And the hardest and weirdest one there is the Scorn, of course.
Oh, it's so good. I love it, though. I love it.
But I think the Scorn would have a really hard time explaining this in any way other than returned ancestors of some kind. But I liked the notion that came up in chat yesterday that like it kind of shows that there are beings that care about the Scorn somewhere. Somewhere someone cares about the Scorn. They're not fully abandoned. And the notion of this being potentially the hand of Mordekar.
Oh, Mordekar.
Reaching from inside the guts of the devourer worm.
Our boy escaped death once. Maybe
he has been shown. He's one of the few beings that's escaped death. But anyway, the idea is that the Void Archon could represent all of these things, and it's not necessarily a contradiction. That for each of these factions, the Void Archon can be something different. And the Void Archon's one in particular where I want to see people get creative with their conversion work.
Yeah.
But we should probably try to anser some questions.
Oh,
I know I've been rambling quite a bit.
Absolutely. No, these are delightful. We'll go through some of these we kind of touched on already.
Sure.
But someone says the Lord of the Feast, an Archon.
So I'd say it's not an Archon, but it is it is an aspect of the worm.
Right.
So,
But if he, hypothetically, because Barnabas, I see him as kind of in the midst of ascension, right? Like he's not like
he's pretty much there.
You think so? So if he becomes like a full god on,
You're insulting him, right?
I know. I apologize. He could potentially send out his own archons, in theory.
Maybe.
No.
Well, I think the notion would be that like he wouldn't feel that that's necessary.
Sure, but if he wanted to,
Sure.
if he wanted to,
Sure.
he could. Are the archons like Grimkin war beasts, but created by the gods instead of the defiers?
Oh, we didn't talk about the Grimkin, so they're connected to the primal.
The primal one,
Archon,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
I'm sorry. So the question was.
Are the archons like the Grimkin war beasts, but created by the gods instead of the defiers? So
somewhat. I mean, I think the notion is, as we talked about when we're talking about soul goo, that all of our higher beings are made of spiritual energy in one form or another, and Grimkin are sort of transformed souls. I feel like the Archons are more like drops of divinity. So to me, that's slightly different. They're not made out of souls, whereas most of the Grimkin are. So, but they are spiritual, sort of transfigured spiritual beings. So there's definitely some kind of a connection there.
Crate 98 asks, are the archons a reason that convergence makes angels? So I guess he's talking about like the idea that Moran archons were traditionally seen with angelic wings.
Right.
Is that like a cultural holdover maybe?
A little bit. I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit in the model entry for those, that their form it's almost like an Art Deco interpretation of this this angelic form, and I think that it could be that they see. Like if you're going to imagine the manifestation of the Maiden of Gears, it's a form that is pleasing. It's it's an aesthetically perfect form, right. And we kind of tied those particular sort of angelic forms into. I think we attribute it to Aurora, and so the notion is that's basically it's an art project, but it could be related to the form that we're seeing of the Void Archon as well. Another one of these ideas where like the beliefs of people can affect the form that happens. But I think it's even more directly here, especially if they're making part of that form. Like if you're in the convergence and you're asked to create this form that then becomes inhabited by an Archon, it's a little bit more direct there.
And I always find it interesting that it's also like the angels, the final form of a clockwork angel has nothing to do with the original person's form. So it could have been a dude, right?
Sure,
that
absolutely.
eventually becomes
absolutely
female-looking, clockwork angel. That's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of transhuman aspects to the convergence.
Steve Jonas asks, do archons have free will, or are they directly controlled by their gods?
I think that would be one of the important distinctions, and the fact that they don't come from souls exactly, although maybe the Morrowind ones do with the ascended Primarchs and so on. Like one of the ideas with a soul is that a soul has free will. And so I think that when we talk about, for example, the Morrowind Archons giving up a little bit of their individuality to become part of the host, I think what they're doing is giving up a little bit of their free will. And so I think that for the most part, again, nothing is 100% with the Archons because we got some weird ones, but they are a little bit lacking in free will. And I would say that's probably even one of the big differences between like the primal Archon and the Lord of the Feast, is the Lord of the Feast probably has a little bit more decision making. Right. Clearly Barnabas does. Like Barnabas is an ascended soul like Morrow almost. I mean, the Morrowans probably wouldn't agree, but basically Barnabas is a Gatorman who has ascended to a higher form, and so he still has free will. Whereas I think like an Archon of the Worm doesn't necessarily have free will.
Now, and what's interesting is we've also talked about the idea that powerful personalities might come back as archons that retain more of their personalities, like in the future.
But I feel like when you're acting as an archon, you're probably like sent on a mission, and taking on that form somewhat limits your ability to make decisions.
Sure.
You're sort of on a script.
Sure.
When you're sent into the world.
Absolutely. This next question I'll answer.
Okay, sure.
Micah Charles Bose, sorry, butchering your name. Do the Infernals and the Gift actually have anything to do with the Rivening and the disappearance of the Elven Divine Court? I'll take that one. Pick up Oblivion. It comes out at the end of the year, and we'll just pick up Oblivion.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be getting into some of the previously unanswered mysteries. There still will be mysteries left when Oblivion is done. But
can't give it all away.
but there's some specifically some of the root of, the infernal bargain for the gift, how that affected the elven gods. That is something that Oblivion's going to get into to some degree.
Kung Brew asks, how are Khadorians reacting to this, seeing both the Old Faith and Morrowind Faith be represented? Has there been any divide in the military, or is it just Vlad and the Cav for Menoth and the rest for more? So I guess I kind of see that, right? Like, if you're like a soldier in Khador and you see a literal manifestation of Menoth appearing before you,
sure,
you might be like, am I kind of wasting my time here?
But then Morrowind one shows up, high fives you.
That's right. All right, so, let's get to work.
But I think one of the ideas, there's a few things to talk about here. Like with Oblivion, we're kind of just at the beginning of the invasion.
Right.
Like we can kind of extrapolate a little bit, but like the full ramifications internally of the infernal invasion and the conflicts and these strange alliances, it's all kind of in process.
Right.
And so I do think there could be some tension within the military and some confusion about chain of command. Like when an avatar or archon of a god shows up, like how does that affect your obedience to your local commandant or kovnik? But I feel like for the most part, one of the ideas is the infernal threat is big. These guys are showing up at key moments of massive supernatural battles. And so in that moment, you kind of put aside some of your theological differences, and you're just glad that the giant armor suit of fire is helping fight the infernals for you. And but I think one of the ideas with Khador in particular is Khador's been one of the few nations we've shown that's kind of come to an accord between the Menites and Morrowans. It's not always comfortable, but like there's Menites and Morrowans serving alongside each other in the Khadoran army, and they just don't talk about that too much. And it'd be a little harder not to talk about it when one of these Archons shows up. But the idea is it's not a monotheistic religion. Like they know that Morrow is a god, they know that Menoth is a god. They might disagree about what you're supposed to obey, what you're supposed to do, but like it's not surprising to even a Menite if like a Morrowind Archon shows up.
Because the gods are reality, right?
They've had to reconcile that.
Right.
That's even like an important moment in our history is showing like where the Menites are like, okay, I guess the twins did ascend to godhood. That's like one of those big kind of coming, sort of religious things that had to happen in the background. But
and finally, Kung Brew again asks, in setting, does this represent a specific period of time where Archons are being sent to Cain, or will Archons continue to be needed after the events of Oblivion?
Again, that's looking further into the future than we can comfortably answer, but one of the ideas is that we are at a very important moment in history. Like this infernal invasion is not just sort of a one-off, like, oh, we did some fighting and now everything is saved and we're good. Like the world will be changing
forever
in Oblivion. There's definitely some lasting consequences. We might not yet explore those, but the infernal invasion is a big deal. We wouldn't be seeing all these factions working together that normally wouldn't. The manifestation of these Archons, like the notion would be like, I can't remember exactly what year we set it in, maybe 612 AR, but from this point forward, there is a bit of a before the Infernals, after the Infernals, and we're going to be seeing a lot of dramatic, exciting, scary changes, as things go forward, including affecting some of our very familiar characters.
Absolutely.
And that'll be some of the fun that's coming up in the very near future.
So that is our time for this week.
Sure.
Is there anything else last thoughts you want to say about Oblivion and Archons before we recap our streaming schedule and get out of here?
Well, somebody was asking if any atheists are kicking around. I would say there's few atheists after the Infernals pour into the world and these holy Archons show up and start fighting. I mean, things are definitely getting more cosmological in a hurry, and that's kind of where we're at. I think that we've answered a few questions and definitely planted the seeds for more, which is kind of my goal. And hopefully we'll get a chance to take over these airwaves again The next time everybody vanishes, we will be here. So.
But we have our regular schedule,
Yeah,
our Dev Hangout on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. We also have Get Your Paint On Thursdays, which will return next Thursday triumphantly. We also have our staff showdown, which will be happening tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Oh, wow.
Between Hungerford and Jeff Olson, having some wars, some fun.
Do you know what they're playing?
They're playing War Machine.
Okay.
And then monthly Primecast Live the week after this Friday, April 19th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where we get into some more of the upcoming things and our con schedule and talk about, CID things and some other future upcoming things that we can't talk about quite yet. But that's it. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thanks for joining us, and hope my rambling was useful in one way or
always
another.
was.
Time just flew by so fast.
I loved it. I mean, I'm Josh Colon, and this is, of course, Doug Seacat,
Yep.
the legendary Doug Seacat. Thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time, whenever that is.
Oh, well, the beginning of this document to be shared with us in post.